All right, if I could have everybody's attention. I know, so lame, so lame. I know, we got all hangovers from Chick-fil-A, but remember, they're closed tomorrow, so, just leave it at that. We want to get started on this. We're right on time, actually, so thank you. We wanted to start this final session, and I want to invite Tom Gilson up for a quick word on something very related to this and to what goes on here in the Dayton-Cincinnati area. Tom?
Thank you. And Paul, he gave me 30 minutes, so we're good.
I gave him 2.
So, yeah. 2 things to know about. One, for those of you who like apologetics, you may not know, we have an apologetics fellowship that meets in Westchester, but it's a Dayton-Cincinnati area apologetics fellowship that I want to invite you to. I don't have anything on paper about it here, but go to apologeticsfellowship.org. apologeticsfellowship.org. It's still an incomplete website, but it gives you enough to find us. So if you want to be in a fellowship with people who do apologetics, that's one thing. We are also helping to host a conference that's taking place in Westchester at Faith Community United Methodist Church. Our friends back there, Brenda and Fred, are big in leading it. And there will be flyers you can find out here. It's next Friday and Saturday. Speakers from out of town. J. Warner Wallace, an amazing speaker who took his cold case detective skills as a detective in Los Angeles County to investigate Christ and found out it was true. Tim McGrew is coming from Western Michigan, amazing on the Gospels. And another guy who's coming in not from out of town, and that's me. But hope to see you there. Check out a flyer. And for the rest of,
No, go ahead.
How am I doing?
You're doing really good. Keep going.
Done. I could tell you about how good Paul Gould is. Yeah, just see ya.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, Tom will be, in the lobby. We got stuff on the welcome table regarding that. So we're just coming up to 1 o'clock. So thank you again for being here, being with us. And Paul, come on up for the final session.
All right. So good. And Tom's a big deal, by the way. So you guys in apologetics. So you have a real resource here to use and to know and all that here. So okay. So what we're gonna do? I'm not gonna. This isn't gonna be a long talk, but it's sort of a fruitful talk on story, and then we can just have a kind of free for all for whatever you all want to talk about. If we, depending on how much time we have, because I know I've thrown out a ton of stuff today, but I did want to. I'm excited to do this because this is an area that I wrote that book on cultural apologetics, and people really have resonated with the stuff on beauty and art, and been interacting with a lot of artists, and the need to be affirmed in their call for those who are called to be artists, to be affirmed in that. And so I've been thinking and reading and writing a lot about story. And so I thought I'd just begin, because it's kind of fun, with a couple years ago, Ethel and I was teaching at a seminary in Texas, and my wife and I, it was our 20th anniversary and so she was able to come over. And the cool thing was, so I was teaching at a seminary in Texas, and we did a trip to Oxford. So it was Texas students in Oxford, and I was teaching on C.S. Lewis in Oxford, which is like my dream, right? My favorite author in Oxford, teaching on C.S. Lewis in Oxford with these Texas students. But it was kind of like this existential pilgrimage for me. Went everywhere that Lewis was. So here, if you know, this is the Eagle and Child. This is the bar that he would meet weekly with the other members of the Inklings, like J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams and others. And so I probably went like 6 times there in the 2 weeks that we're there. The burgers are good, but they're not that great. Anyway, so from there, this is his home. This is the Kilns. It was the reason why it's called the Kilns. I was just talking to the director of the C.S. Lewis Foundation. I didn't know this, but it was built on an old brick factory location. So it's the Kilns, a beautiful place. Went there once for an official tour. Went there once and snuck back because I wanted to get more. In his backyard, there is a series of ponds. This is one of them. Most of them have been filled in, but it's really cool walking there because you start to think like, this is what he was imagining when he was writing The Magician's Nephew, if you remember the world between the ponds, right? So cool. This is a bench that Tolkien and Lewis would smoke on, sit and smoke their pipes, and then there was actually, it faces that pond. But I thought it was cool to sit there, walk the land with him. At his house, there's actually not a lot of pictures of C.S. Lewis. There's a pretty small number of pictures, and they're all well known. This is one of the famous ones, but I couldn't resist. Snuck in one day and did that. That was kind of cool. So yeah, so that was a lot of fun. From there, so I taught the class in C.S. Lewis, had a great time in Oxford. From there, Ethel and I split off from the group, and we're going to go kind of celebrate our 20th anniversary. And so we went up to Edinburgh, and we went to this coffee shop, which is called the Elephant House. And if you walk into the Elephant House and you go all the way to the back, there's a huge bay window. And looking in the bay window, you see this. This is Edinburgh Castle. And you begin to think, through the eyes of J.K. Rowling, what she was imagining, when she's writing about Hogwarts. Also, in Edinburgh, one of our favorite authors, we went to Robert Louis Stevenson's house, and there's a little museum there, and we walked through that, and we learned about him. And even, so he wrote Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and Treasure Island. But even walking through the streets of Edinburgh, you begin to, I know he wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the streets of London, but you can kind of imagine what he was thinking as you walk the streets of Edinburgh. And it looks very much like a 19th century, city street. He's in part of the Miracle Mile there. From there, we went to Haworth. And this is my wife in the foreground. And then in the background, I don't know if you can see it, there's the house of the Bronte sisters. They lived and worked and wrote there in Haworth. And what was so cool about this is we did a private 3-hour tour with a Haworth scholar, a Bronte sisters scholar. And he learned everything about the Bronte sisters. We walked, these are the moors. If you've read Wuthering Heights, the whole backdrop of the moors, there they are, and they were beautiful. And so we're just being nourished on our favorite authors. I think we're English in another life or something. I don't know, because they're all over there. From there, we went to, let's see, this is Jane Austen's house. This is in the village of Chawton near Alton in Hampshire. But this is her house where she lived and wrote. This is the desk that she wrote Pride and Prejudice on, which is pretty cool. Spent a day there, and we actually spent, we spent a night there, and so we learned that this house is in a really small village, and then right across the street, there's a huge estate. There's the estate. That's my wife, and there's the estate behind her. We stayed in a bed and breakfast on this estate, which was basically like the kitchen house, but it was amazing. The kitchen house was amazing, and that was cool. But then we would just walk the fields, and we can kind of imagine what she was thinking about with Pemberley, and Darcy, just looking at the estate. This was her uncle, who was the benefactor that basically supported her. From here, we went next to Stratford-upon-Avon, and we toured Shakespeare's house and kind of spent a day thinking about him. And then from there, we went to the Lake District, where Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge wrote their poetry, and we walked the same crags that Wordsworth would walk. They call them crags there. They're not mountains, but they're not hills. They're somewhere in between, and they're just awesome. And we walked a whole day, and it was phenomenal. We walked those, and we bought some of Wordsworth's poetry and read that, and really had a great time from there. And so what's interesting is we did not plan this, but we ended up taking a literary vacation. We ended up visiting all of our favorite authors, and we love reading, we love books, and so we just kind of did this naturally. But what was interesting, the more that we would kind of visit these favorite authors, there was other things that were stirring in my heart, just this. I think my imagination was stirred, and this longing to live a life, a great life, kind of is awoken. Is that the right word? Awake, as we walk these ancient streets and well-worn trails of all these authors. And that leads us to a really provocative thought. This is a book by Kent Kruger called This Tender Land. Anybody read this? Okay, yeah. Did you like it? Yeah, beautiful book. This book, a New York Times bestseller, he's becoming one of my favorite authors. Just read his other book, Ordinary Grace. Have you read that one? Yep, good. So he caught me in the first paragraph, because here's a very provocative thought of this book. This is what he says, very provocative. He says, in the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and the sea, and all the living things that dwell therein, after he created man and woman, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift, lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. That's a really provocative thought, right? And it makes sense. Stories are a gift, like everything else. And it's a gift from God to remind us of the source of all that's good and true and beautiful. And so what I want to do is to kind of explore that provocative thought, you know? And I want to sort of begin to build a theology of story with you, just briefly, because I think you'll find it kind of inspiring, because I find it inspiring. And I want to do it through C.S. Lewis and some of his thoughts. C.S. Lewis has a lot to say, and he's got a really robust theology of stories. So my plan is to give you 3 observations from Lewis about stories, and then I want to give you a tentative definition, and then give you some payoffs about it, okay? And then we'll just have a conversation about really whatever you want, okay? All right, so 3 observations about stories from C.S. Lewis. The first one is that humans, it's about us. Humans are narratival animals. Let me give you the essay. So in 1945, he wrote an essay called Is Theology Poetry? Here, and it's collected in this essay. And he says this in there. He says, man is a poetical animal and touches nothing which he does not adorn. So in other words, everything that we touch, we adorn it with meaning. And the idea is that this reveals this deep intuition that we hold about the world. Right? The deep intuition is that the world is coherent, it's rational, it's intelligible, it's meaningful. And so the idea is, and as you read, and I've been reading theologians and philosophers and historians on this, the idea is that humans are storytelling creatures, we're story-listening creatures, and we're story-making creatures. That's what I mean to say that humans are narratival animals, right? We're storytelling, story-listening, and story-making creatures. And all of this, and by the way, this is something that's been widely recognized now by theologians, philosophers, historians, and sociologists. And really it has the ring of truth to it as well, right? And so theologically, that raises this really interesting question, like what grounds this storytelling, story-making, story-listening capacities? And the answer that's often given is that we are poetical animals, you know, because God himself is poetical, creating a distinct reality with a beginning and a middle and an end, right? A story, a divine drama, and that we're creatures made in the image of this story-making God. So I just want to show you Lewis, Tolkien, and Chesterton, what they say on this question. Why are we story-making animals? Well, here's what Lewis says in a little essay, Myth Became Fact, that you can find in God in the Dock if you want to know where to find these. He grounds his poetical activities in God. He says, if God chooses to be mythopoetic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? So I'll come back to this quote in a minute. I want to give you there's actually a little bit more that he says, but I just for now I want us to note, you know, he's connecting this story narratival nature that we have to the fact that God is a story-making God. Tolkien, in 1939, he wrote a wonderful essay called An Essay on Fairy Stories. It's a phenomenal essay, actually. It's really hard to read if you're not like steeped in like Old English literature, but there's some really great nuggets in there that are, and I could pull those out for you if you want and summarize them. But one famous line he said there is, he talks about how humans have this kind of enchanter's power, right? It's a great phrase. You know, we have this kind of enchanter's power to create in the derivative mode, and he famously said that we are sub-creators. You know, God is the creator, and we create in the derivative mode as sub-creators. And I love he says things like, you know, when it comes to the stories we tell, we have the power to remove like the green from the grass, and the blue from the sky, and the red from the blood. You know, to tell these strange stories about blue grass and red sky and green blood. And he calls it strange and wonderful power that we have, a power that's unique to man. Chesterton, who you know, has a lot of really cool things to say, he notes that humans alone are created with the ability for art. He says that in The Everlasting Man. Did I do that? Oh, no, you did that. Okay. Yeah, I can still give you the quote. He says this. He says, art is the signature of man. That's a provocative quote. Art is a signature of man. And then he continues, alone among the animals, man is shaken with beautiful madness, this beautiful madness called laughter, as if he has caught sight of some secret in the very shape of the universe, hidden from the universe itself. So again, provocative thought. And this is the first observation, the first Lewisian observation about stories, that we're poetical, we're narratival animals. And the idea is that we come into this world with the sense that we're part of an ongoing story, right? Go back to what we talked about before, right? We come into this world, and then we take up our place, and we listen, we tell, we make, and we tell, and we live stories. Okay. Observation number 2. Click, click. There it is. Observation number 2 is that stories uniquely reveal meaning. So stories communicate in a way that nothing else can, if you think about it. And okay, so what Lewis does is he endorses, yeah, there it is. He endorses something in philosophy of art called aesthetic cognitivism. Now I'm going to just give you a little. If you don't want it, that's fine. But there's all these debates about these two questions in philosophy of art, and the questions are what is art, and then what is the chief value of art. Aesthetic cognitivism answers that question. The chief value of art has to do with communication of understanding. That the really good art communicates truth. It helps us understand the world, or the human experience of the world, or something like that. That's called aesthetic cognitivism. So Lewis endorses this view. This is the view I think is the right view. And he endorses it. So here's a little quote. He's got a great essay in this collection of essays called On Stories, where he says this about stories. He says 3 things I just want you to notice. He says stories are series of imagined events. Sounds good enough so far. But then he goes on to say this. He says, it must be understood that the series, the plot, as we call it, is only really a net whereby we catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or quality. I love this idea of, the real thing is this net where you're trying to capture something. And then he goes on to say what we're trying to capture. He says, that is, life and art, as it seems to me, we are always trying to catch in our nets of successive moments something that is not successive, rather something internal. And that's actually a really interesting observation. Good stories reveal deep truths about prime reality. That's actually how Tolkien would put it. Good stories reveal deep truths about prime reality. They pull back that curtain, and they give us a glimpse of reality as it really is. Okay? So stories, imagined series of events, reveal meaning. And by the way, Lewis has this other he famously said that the imagination is the organ of meaning. And the idea was that we have all these, we perceive the world around us, and we deliver these raw sense perceptions to our imagination. And then our imagination as the organ of meaning helps us to understand what we perceive. And then in understanding what we perceive, we deliver it to reason, to judge it as true and false, and then once we judge it as true, we deliver it to our will to act, right? So he had this really kind of interesting view. But the imagination for Lewis, the organ of meaning, is that which helps us to understand the world around us. And so that's why Lewis will always, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but he will always, in his writings, bring the imagination along with him, right? When he reasons, for even in Mere Christianity, he begins, the first 5 chapters, he gives a famous articulation of the argument from meaning. But if you notice the very first paragraph, he immediately puts us in a context that's very familiar with us. 2 people quarreling, right? He's awakening our imagination, and then he takes us along on a journey. So, okay. So, for example, I just taught last semester, the spring, a philosophy and literature class. I lead this grad program in philosophy of religion. And we did a philosophy of literature class, and I read Lewis's science fiction trilogies. And so, for example, when Lewis wants us to understand the difference between space and heaven, these 2 different words, right? He tells us a wonderful story about a kidnapped Cambridge Dawn who's basically kidnapped and taken on a spaceship to Mars, to Malacandra, right? Beautiful story that helps us to understand and sort of recapture the discarded image of the medieval cosmos. Or, for example, when he wants us to understand the nature of spiritual battle, he tells us a story about that same Cambridge Dawn, this time on a journey to Perilandra, which is Venus, and who gets in a real fisticuffs battle with the incarnate devil himself, right? And so he teaches us about the nature of spiritual battle. Or when he wants us to teach us about the dangers of moral subjectivism, he tells a story about a cosmic battle between the good and the evil in this quaint little English town in Belbury, right? So this is how the imagination helps us to understand. Just a little more close to home, when we moved to Texas a number of years ago, we were not football people, we're soccer people, and we wanted to understand Texas better, so I read this book Friday Night Lights. And it actually helped me understand the town I was living in that centers its entire life around football, right? You read a story. When we moved 2 years ago to Florida, I wanted to understand a little bit about that, so I read this historical fiction about the founding of southern Florida. It's called A Land Remembered. And it actually helps me to understand, through the eyes of this fiction, a little bit more about how the state of Florida came to be. And so Lewis would put it this way. He says, in reading great literature, you become 1,000 men and yet remain yourself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad of eyes, but it is still I who see. Right? Stories communicate meaning in unique ways, and they help us to see through the eyes of the author and the story. All right, that's our second observation. Third and final observation, the gospel is the normative story of every human being. Now, normative, just a fancy word for how things ought to be, right? So this is the story that makes sense. It's the one story to rule them all, to borrow from Tolkien, right? And that's what the gospel is. So think of it this way, though. Since you live according to stories, and since we live on stories, the question is, of all the stories, is there one that's alive and true? That's the question that you ask. And even in my evangelism, I do a lot of traveling and speaking at universities. Like, usually they'll want me to come in and answer the question, does God exist? Or why would God allow pain and suffering? Like typical apologetics, philosophy kind of things. And I've kind of changed the way that I start to, there's kind of like a standard way you can walk through the arguments, and I do that. But I've changed that in two ways as I've thought more about stories lately. The first thing I've changed is, and actually Keller has taught us well on this, I just say, could you just for 20 minutes, just consider the possibility that Jesus is better than you've been told? Just for 20 minutes, this is what I ask of my students. Just give me 20 minutes to consider the possibility that Jesus actually satisfies the deep longings of your heart. And the second thing I say, though, so for example, if I can remember one time I asked to come and talk on the problem of evil. Why does God allow suffering? And what Keller's done so well is what is the sin beneath the sin? Or what is the question, or the intuition beneath the question? So the intuition behind that question, why does God allow pain and suffering, is the intuition is this isn't right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? We have this deep set intuition that drives that question. And so what I've started to do is say, look, of all the competing stories out there, because there's so many, consumerism, hedonism, materialism, naturalism, postmodernism, you name it, pick a story. Is there one that's alive and that understands you? Because that's what a story is, something that's inviting our participation, seeking our allegiance. So ask the question, is there one that's alive and that understands you? And of course, the good news is there is one, and that's the gospel, because in that you find Jesus. So here's Lewis. Prior to his conversion, I think you were talking earlier about his he went from non-theist to theist, then it took a little while, and he became finally Christian. But there's this sort of famous quote in his biography here, Surprised by Joy, where he describes his pre-conversion mindset. And for him, this is what he says. He says, he has these two hemispheres of my mind that were in the sharpest of conflict. On the one side, a many island sea of poetry and myth, so that's the romantic side. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism, so that's the reason side. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. That's the romantic side. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So this was his description of his pre-conversion mindset. What he really loved were the stories. What he thought was true, he was trained by this Scottish Presbyterian atheist named Knox. I know that, I know. Anyway, that's how he's described. They call him the old hard knocks or whatever, and he, really rationalist, and so this is what he was kind of brought up in, but he didn't like that. That didn't nourish his heart. And so what Lewis came to discover is that only in Christianity can you unite the two hemispheres of your mind. You have the reason and the romance. So Christianity is this perfect blend of reason and romance. Romance, root word Rome, Latin for home, right? The longing for home. All of that, you get that, reason and romance. And so he came to call it true myth. Christianity is true, and it's myth. It's a true story. And so here is the rest of that quote I mentioned earlier from this myth became fact. Look at how he kind of shows this perfect blend. So here's that first part. If God chooses to be mythopoetic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopoetic? But here's what he says after that. For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth, and perfect fact, story, but true story, claiming not only our love and obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, the poet in each of us, no less than the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. Everyone, right? True myth, perfect blend of reason and romance. And of course, it is the normative story, the story that rules them all. Okay, cool. Let me give you my proposed definition then. Just kind of summing up what Lewis is saying. I want to just give you this and some observations. So a good story is a dramatic account that binds together ideas, events, images, and agents into an intelligible pattern. But here's the purpose and the value: in order to reveal deep truth about prime reality, right? So I'm distinguishing good stories from stories. But a good story, the chief value, remember aesthetic cognitivism? The chief value is to reveal understanding about the world or about the human experience of the world or some aspect of it. Now let me just give a couple observations from this, and then I'll give you some practical things, and then I'll be done. Now notice, stories are ordered accounts that reflect the order and coherence of existence itself, right? And so one theologian says that stories provide a way of a scene in the dark. I think that's a great way to think about stories. And I think our storytelling nature implies that our experience of time is not incoherent and meaningless. So like, for example, you've got philosophers, they're called the existentialist philosophers. They would argue that we live in this theater of the absurd, right? That reality is absurd. And I think they're wrong, right? The intuition is that, I think Calvin got it right. Calvin famously said in the Institutes, he said that the heavens and the earth are a dazzling theater of God's glory. I think that's right. It's a dazzling theater of God's glory. Not a theater of the absurd, but a dazzling theater of God's glory. So stories, I think, reveal this intuition that reality is coherent and rational and meaningful. They have a dramatic quality to them, right? They always involve action, and they link and recount struggle. Here's a really deep one. Here we go. You ready? They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Cool? Actually, though, think about it. Stories ask and answer three related questions. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And how do I get there? Right? These are the questions of origin, destiny, and quest. Right? And in understanding the story of a person's life, like the literary story, we can judge whether that person is a wanderer or a pilgrim. Right? You can actually read the story of their life, and you can judge that based on how they live it. A wanderer lacks direction, whereas the pilgrim is guided by hope and the conviction that there is genuine meaning in the world. So like think of, and again, I don't know how much of a reader you guys are, but think of like David Foster Wallace, if you know this name, and his book Infinite Jest, just completely like chaos, right? Or verses like a Homer's Odyssey or a Pilgrim's Progress, where you have, this quest, that's the pilgrim's quest. Stories address problems to be solved, and usually, not always, they have like three stages. They have like this initial blissful moment, or a paradise, or Elysium, or home. And then there's a story that's initiated from some conflict. And then after a successful hero's quest, there's a kind of homecoming or rebirth, or resolution is achieved. And as I would want to say, that all are known by their true name, right? There's a happy ending. And so this leads to the big idea, I think, is that this is actually from a theologian, Urban Holmes. He says that stories reach toward theological understanding. So they reach toward primordial beginnings, right, of the universe, of our species, of our lives. They reach toward that pilgrim's quest, and I think they reach toward the end of all things, or the renewal of all things. And so our job, again, as theologians, as apologists, as lovers of stories, I think, is to help others see the connections that stories are reaching toward. Right? That's part of the joy of it, because I think they also reach toward God. Okay, 4 practical applications, then we can talk. So let me just give you 4 thoughts on if something like this, as we're working toward a theology of story, is right. Here's some thoughts. Number 1, and I say this to my students who like to watch TV a lot, and I do too, but read good stories. Yes, you can watch stories too. But read them, and read them for the sheer pleasure that they bring. In fact, C.S. Lewis, he distinguished 2 kinds in that essay on story. He distinguished 2 kinds of pleasure that stories provide. The first kind of pleasure was what he calls excitement, mere excitement, he called it. He thought this was kind of a shallow pleasure. It'd be like, he was picking on the book Three Musketeers. I'm thinking like the Bourne Identity series, or maybe like the Avengers. Sorry, if they're teens, the Avengers series. Things that you watch and they're kind of fun, but you just forget about them like literally 2 minutes after you watch them. Yeah, so that's fine. He likes that stuff, but he thinks there's a second kind of pleasure. I would call it it's the pleasure of the quest. He doesn't really name it, but I'm going to call it the pleasure of the quest. And this is a kind of pleasure where you step into this secondary world. And it's a rich world, and you basically spend time in this world, and you find deep pleasure that's aroused as you explore the deeper parts of the imagination. You take in the scenery, its characters, its plot, its adventures, and the whole atmosphere of the secondary world. And again, just think of Narnia or the Middle Earth, right? These are rich secondary worlds that evoke this deeper pleasure. And by the way, Lewis and Tolkien are actually brilliant. I don't know if you knew, they have a rich theology of story and a rich theology of fantasy. So what are they doing in creating these rich worlds? Well, they're awakening our longing to go there, right? We want to go to the Tolkien worlds, and that's why we've got this $1 billion show that people are split on, if it's good. I'm a Narnia guy myself, right? I want to go back to Narnia all the time and read those things. And what they're doing is they're awakening our longing for these secondary worlds so that we will awaken to the only other actual world we can ever enter, which is the kingdom of God. So they have this rich theology of story and what they're doing and creating these imaginative worlds and awakening these longings. So, okay, anyway, that was for free. Second, read stories to understand culture. Yeah. So imaginative fiction, and this should be, as you think about this might be pretty obvious, right? Imaginative fiction of a culture reveals what's currently experienced as important to those cultures, right? So if you want to know what's important, check out the New York Times bestseller list. In fact, I try to do that every year. I try to read off the New York Times bestseller. I end up enjoying the books a lot, but really it also helps you understand what people care about, right? So pay attention to that stuff. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin to galvanize a nation about the horror of slavery. She told a story, right? And actually Lincoln talked about that story as instrumental in the process of going to war over it. Today you read about the hate you give, or the Underground Railroad, or Infinite Jest, to read about the realities of injustice or racism or the angst of a disenchanted world. So read the stories to understand culture and what people consider important. Third, use stories in evangelism and in apologetics. So you might be interested to know that there's this huge is the wrong word. There's this really interesting sub-movement in apologetics where people are realizing the value of stories and the value of stories in apologetics and in making the case for Christ. So for example, that first book there by Alistair McGrath called Narrative Apologetics is a whole book about how you can use stories to present the gospel to others. And McGrath is a C.S. Lewis scholar, so he quotes a lot of Lewis. But Lewis famously said, stories, bypass those watchful dragons that are, of reason that kind of guard, and they kind of do a run around and get to the heart. And so, anyway, so you get a whole book. The other book there is by Holly Ordway. It's an excellent book. What is it called? I can't read that. Christian Imagination and something like that. Maybe I'll turn and look. There it is. Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. I'm trying to read over there. Yeah, bad eyes. Okay, so yeah, that's a wonderful book. Holly's, former atheist, converted to Christianity through teaching English and reading the great literature of the tradition. And it's a wonderful book. She's a Tolkien scholar, actually, and a Lewis scholar. So use it. And then finally, you'd be remiss if we didn't end with this: locate your life in the story of God. Ask these two questions of yourself, of your family, of those you interact with. Is there a story that's alive? Is there a story that understands you? And of course, we know, the answer is yes. It's the gospel story. So, self-promotion. I do have a podcast, and my most recent season 6, I just did it on C.S. Lewis's science fiction trilogy. And so I talk a little bit about Lewis's theology of story there, and then we kind of walk through the Ransom trilogy. So if you want to check that out, you can just Google Udo Podcast, wherever you get if you do podcasting. And then I will also want to self-promote. So remember earlier when I said that we return to reality by doing two things. Number one, we learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And number two, we invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. Those are two future book projects for me. One is written for believers. I want to really dig a little bit deeper into this first one about how do we learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. The second one is for non-believers, and that's the book that's coming out in a couple weeks. It's called A Good and True Story, where it's not a book about cultural apologetics. It's actually a book of cultural apologetics, where I try to do all the things that I say we should do in apologetics, and I take the reader on a journey of discovery to discover the true story of the world, and we look at these 11 features of the world, and I try to do it with creativity and argument and story and image and all that. So that's coming out. So anyway, it's coming out in November. So you can get it on Amazon, I believe. That's it. Okay, that's it. So we've got 30 minutes. I wanted to have a shorter, I wanted to share that because it's cool and it's fun to talk about Lewis. But we can talk about the story, but we can also just talk about whatever you want. Yeah. Did you bring books? I did not, sorry. No. Amazon. Yeah. Like.
So I was thinking about something sitting there, and I remember that I read it from something you said.
Yeah.
The story of the cosmos. And you talked about rediscovering the medieval cosmos and sort of adopting that. And you mentioned it here too. You talked about specifically Augustine and Calvin. And I'm very intrigued by that idea myself. Um, but what I was wondering is like, how far do you take that? Because well, I mean, it's a Ptolemaic, system.
Right. Yeah.
I'm kind of into that. I'm not like,
Yeah.
it's intriguing, but I mean,
It's not factually true though. Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, now, well, Lewis covers that in the discarded image, but
Mhm.
like, how do you deal with that, and present that, or embody that?
Good. Yeah. Okay. Good. So you do know Lewis's move in the discarded image. Like obviously we don't let the nymphs back in and the all the stuff from the sacramental image back in. Some of it's factually wrong. But what he thought was most tragic about losing the medieval view of the world was the imaginative, sort of the imaginative force of it. The idea that so he called it the medieval viewed the universe as a great cathedral. So that was the image that was before our mind, and now it's a mechanical clock at best. Like just things. So I think what I would want to recapture from the medieval cosmos is not the science of it, because you're right, it's wrong. Lewis knew that too, but yeah. But I do think I want to capture the two things: the participatory nature of the world and the semiotic function of the things in the world. So I know that's a big word. Semiotic is the study of signs. So all that means, and all I mean, is that, and this was the classic view, was that everything in this world points back to and illuminates the divine in some way. That's the semiotic nature of the created creature. And that's really grounded in the doctrine of creation. If all things are created by God, all things illuminate God in some way. That's the part of the sacramental universe that I want to recapture. Everything is participates in God in some way, so there's a really tight connection, and everything points to God. And the reason why I want to capture that, and maybe this is slightly off what you were asking them, Mike, at this point, is this other sociologist named Philip Reef, who wrote a book called My Life Among the Death Works, talks about how the time we find ourselves in now is different than any other time in the history of the world, because every other culture except for the one we're basically in now thought there's a tight connection between the sacred order and the natural order. So they're tightly connected and threaded. One participated in the other. Our culture has severed that cord, right? And so I want to reconnect the two. I think there is a tight connection between this world and the sacred order. So that's the stuff I want to get. That's the stuff I want to get back from the medieval view. But you're right. Throw out the rest of the science. Was that kind of your? I feel like I kind of went. Yeah, So I since I wrote the one book, I've been thinking and reading a lot about this language of sacramental. I'm not Anglican or anything, but it seems to be that they're all Anglicans who use this language. But Calvin, of course, everybody used this language up until the 1500s. Everybody said that the universe was sacramental or enchanted. And so I want to recapture that in some way, and I think this participatory notion and this semiotic or pointing notion is at least what I think is crucial. How about behind Tom? So you, right there, yeah. Yeah.
My question is it's a two-part question, one at the beginning, one at the end, with some stuff in the middle that you said. If I got you right, you said, could it be that we, the church or Christians, have an image problem because we have not studied the culture? My first question is, what evidence is there that we haven't studied the culture? My last question is it worth the danger of studying the culture? And the reason is, every person you've cited today, James Smith, he'll wear a transgender thing on his t-shirt. Tim Keller is only bounded in his belief in the historicity of Adam and Eve by the PCA's doctrine. He founded an organization to combat it. Rhett and Link, those guys they have studied the culture. The other folks, the deconstructors, Josh Harris, he's got or had the coolest church in the world. And Hillsong overthrew millennia of church singing to invent a blink, and now they're deconstructing. So all those folks, they have studied the culture. What evidence do you have that we're not doing that? And what evidence do you have that the rest of the church that studies the culture won't go the way all those folks have?
Good. Oh, that's a great question. And I love the nuance. I think what I was thinking when I said that was we need to be people who understand the culture such that we can speak their language. And I think that's part of what it means to love our neighbor. So that's all I meant by that. And so you're right. To understand it, we need to study it. Now, all those people that you mentioned, I mean, I don't agree with everything about Lewis, and you probably don't either, right? But it doesn't mean we can't learn from them, right? Same with all these people.
So Doug Wilson and Carl Truman have both distinguished. When we say the word culture, we mean pop culture. Wilson says pop culture is anti-culture because culture is that which undergirds. Pop
Good.
culture is designed to be.
Good. That's right.
Truman says our culture is a death course.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Did Lewis study what we say is culture or actual culture?
Did Lewis?
Did pop culture even exist really in the 30s and 40s like we think it is?
I think it did. I think it did. I think it's like high school pop culture is like in the 30s it starts to become a thing. That's really interesting. You're right. I haven't actually defined culture here, and so your comments are fair. Have you read Andy Crouch on culture making? Since it sounds like you're familiar with some of these things.
Is his first name Andy?
Yeah.
I think we have one of his books on our shelf.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know what culture is. I mean, I do. It's like one of these things where it's hard to define, but we all kind of know it. So that's why I haven't purposely defined it. And I'm totally fine with like distinguishing pop versus a richer sense of culture. I think that there's various analogies about what culture is that are helpful. It's like an iceberg. There's stuff at the surface, and then the real culture is beneath the surface. That was a classic definition. It's like a estuary. This is Makoto Fujimori. He says, it needs to be cared for. It's like the estuaries where this vibrant place where you have saltwater and freshwater and all these different creatures that thrive in this ecosystem. I think that's a helpful analogy, and there's other analogies too. But I think at the end of the day, culture is what we make of the world. That's what Crouch says. And that seems good enough, but I don't know where a distinction between pop culture would be in that definition, right? And I do also get that distinction. So all that to say, we haven't defined culture. I do think that it's okay to read from these people, and we should be. It doesn't mean we're going to agree with them, because these are the people that they're the ones that are defining reality for us. And so we want to be well-read with them, even if we don't agree with them. I think I missed your question, though, from all this. Yeah.
How do we avoid going to I would say the
Good.
problem with PCA today is emphatically not that we do not understand culture.
Gotcha.
We understand it. It's not that we haven't tried. It's that we really want the culture to love us.
Good.
And my question is then, how do we avoid? I mean, everyone you've cited, I can name literally. I don't want to be like Adam. I don't want my kids to be like them.
Yeah.
I'd rather they didn't study the culture if that's the cost. Is it the cost?
I think there's a temptation. There's a definite temptation to accommodate. The more you are granted access into the halls of elite authority, elite called symbolic capital. So yeah, so I mean, just thinking about that book, Narcissism Goes to Church, right? I mean, there's the dangers everywhere, right? Our hearts are idol factories, whether we're pastors, whether we're elite gatekeepers in the scholarly world. So to me, it just is a reminder of the relentless need to go back to the gospel every day and to be grounded in the things of God in my own life. And then to have people, and then just the normal kind of wisdom, like have people in my life that can speak truth to me. And I don't have anything profound to say except that just being aware that we're all susceptible to that and to be in community, people that care deeply about the things of God and the gospel. Yeah, I mean, so your question isn't that therefore we should ignore them. I mean, I know that, your question is how do we not become like them in those areas that we don't like? And that's all. Don't ignore them, but then let's just be wise as best we can. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. 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 Tom, and then we'll go over this side. We'll go back there. Yeah.
What I was going to say earlier actually ties into that. I don't remember the source, but someone said that one of the problems perhaps with people interacting today is they're not reading enough novels. Because specifically in reading, you learn how to see the world through someone else's eyes. You develop an ability to empathize that you don't get through other methods. I thought it was kind of interesting, and even in answer to what you're saying, Bruce, I think there's something about empathizing with culture so that you can, it's a missionary question.
Yeah.
It's our job to translate. And in order to translate, we have to know the language and you have to know the stories. If you don't know the language, you don't know the stories, it's very difficult to translate effectively. And a missionary, if you go and do missionary work in wherever, the inner city or China or India, you might get assimilated. There is a danger there. There's a danger here. But we have a call to understand for the purpose of translation and for the purpose of love. And like you said, we have, the protection is our own understanding of the gospel, our apologetics, our community life, our prayer, our connection to God. And the world is risky, and there are dangers, but we got a call.
That's good.
Things can go bad, yes.
Yep. Yeah. I'll just say amen. Just go back there.
Yeah, just want to ask your thoughts on Jordan Peterson and like his use of archetypes as it relates to Christianity, if you have any thoughts on that. And second question, what is your favorite C.S. Lewis work, both fictional and non-fictional?
Yeah, okay, good. First question, sorry to disappoint you. I just know zero about Peterson. I haven't had time, so sorry. Yeah, I know I should, right, because he's huge. But I've been writing that other book, and so I had to focus on some things. Yeah, and then Lewis, that's a really hard one. I think my favorite nonfiction, I'm going to go with Till We Have Faces, which is his mythic retelling of Cupid and Psyche. Although the trilogy really rose up after teaching it. And then nonfiction, that's going to have to be maybe just good old Mere Christianity, but I don't know. I love them all. I try to read them all. Yeah.
Suppose I'm a college student and you're teaching class, and I stand up and say, I don't buy any of this story as a good pointer to truth because all of it's from men and all of it's from the West, and it is, so I'm promoting an anti-narrative. The world, I'm following the footsteps of all the existentialists
It's hard to do in a one quick conversation, right? But let me just tell you what I'd be guided by, I think, principles in trying to reach that person. I'm guided by this comment that Lewis says in Abolition of Man, that classically the chief virtue was to conform our souls to reality, and that required knowledge, rightly related to reality, the way the world is, right? So the direction of fit that I think I just want to help, and I just had this conversation with I'm teaching metaphysics with my undergrad students right now, and that's a very hard topic, and they're like, why does this matter? And I had to give this little soapbox about, Jesus's claim, those who want to save their life, must lose it for me, or I forget the exact way he puts it, but when we try to take the world and fit it into my desires, we're going to lose ourselves and the world, right? The direction of fit needs to be the other way. We need to say, what is the truth about the world, and then fit my life into that, conform my soul to that. So that's the principle that would guide me, and I would just try to say that in as many ways as I could. Like, we care about truth is the question, and being rightly related to reality. Why? Because we want to flourish, and we don't flourish when we're not conforming to the way the world is. So that's the first principle. From there, I would just ask questions. You even already pointed out, this is an interesting story that you're telling me. How do you know it's true, right? And I would just ask that question, how do you know it's true? And is it because a non-white person told you? Or is there, so that's where you do have to get into what do you mean by true and things like that. So it's just going to be a long conversation. I find that with these things, the principles are charity, clarity, and then being critical as the third step. So I want to charitably understand. I want to clearly understand what you're saying. I want to be charitable in my interpretation of what you're saying, and then I want to be critical with you once I understand it. And that's how I would approach like the wokeness crowd. I want to understand what you're trying to tell me, and usually in doing that, it puts the burden of proof on them. So in other words, don't you own the burden of truth. They need to own the burden of truth if they're making these claims. And it's much harder to make it sound coherent and meaningful to themselves. And they'll probably just run themselves, a little bit to the ground. Yeah. So don't accept the burden of proof is what I want to say. Yep.
So I think it's kind of encapsulating all this said before. You presented the case for the story being powerful for good. So how do we protect ourselves when the stories that are bad?
Yeah.
The world is full of those stories.
Right, so this is where Christian wisdom is required, right? We don't consume everything that culture gives us, right? I guarantee I would love Game of Thrones. I have no doubt I would love that, the story. I've also heard it's highly pornographic, so Christian wisdom tells me that that's something that I'm just not going to watch, right? And that's what we need to apply, I think, in these questions of the story. So I do not consume, and we should not consume everything. But there are things that we should for various reasons. One could be sheer pleasure of it, but others could be for gaining knowledge. But yeah, I would be really careful with everything. So I mentioned Andy Crouch earlier about culture. He talks about how he distinguishes between postures and gestures. He says our posture toward culture shouldn't be just to merely consume everything culture gives us. He says our posture should be to create our own culture and then to cultivate that which is good and true and beautiful in culture. But then we can gesture and consume at times, right? But then Christian wisdom is that stable character character trait such that we know the grain of reality and we live according to the grain of reality, right? And that's one of the classic virtues, and that's what I would apply. Does that help? That's how I discern those things.
Occurs to me that the emergency room doctor needs to know a lot about cocaine, but not what it feels like to take it.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Good. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, coming from the opera Broadway world, one of the things that I've had to butt heads with is the liberalism, the disgusting just portrayal of sin on stage, and having to take a stand. I will not do this role. I leave that to somebody else, even in college when, said, okay, we're doing this as the opera theater or whatever. No, as a Christian, I'm not
Yep.
Because there's just so much gross and
Yeah.
disgusting stuff out
Right.
there as a Christian trying to make a living
In this area,
It's
yeah.
actually quite hard.
Yeah, that's tough. And that's why, like, we want, we want these rules that are cut and dry, but I don't think it's that easy, right? Because culture's not that easy. And that's where this virtue of wisdom is so important, Christian wisdom. And that entails that we're a certain kind of person to be able to make that. And then the answer is going to be slightly different for each person, too. Like, I think within a range, right? But it would be slightly different. If somebody struggles with something, they're going to stay away from it a little bit more, maybe. So, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
When you talk about studying the culture, I know like a lot of Christians, for example, really studied Islam very carefully. And they went and read the Quran, they read the Hadith, they read the Sirah, and all this thing like that. And they developed very good arguments refuting Islam from that and showing the absurdities that you have in there and the contradictions. And people have done the same thing with rabbinic Judaism, from which Islam came from, and people have done the same thing with Catholicism, and people have done all that with a lot of atheism and other things like that. When you're studying the culture, are you studying it for the purpose of pointing out the flaws in it and the underlying ideologies? If so, what would you say are the three biggest enemies ideologically of the Christian today?
By the way, I think that we study culture, at least the way that I think of it. I want to study culture so that I can reach my neighbor. I want to study culture so I can reach my neighbor, better reach my neighbor. What are the three ideological enemies? Well, I don't know. Let's see. One would be this rejection of what I would call essentialism, which is a doctrine in philosophy that there's a certain essence, a certain way things ought to be being human, let's say. So you have an essence, and that guides the way that you ought to live because you flourish in light of your essence, your nature. So the minute we get rid of essences, it's a view called nominalism, anything goes, right? So that's why we have all this confusion about gender and sexuality. And so the rejection of it's called essentialism. And the rejection of essentialism, I think, is one of the big problems. That's a metaphysical problem, so it requires thinkers to be able to articulate that. But that's why we have gender irrealism now. Sorry. So yeah, rejection of essences, and opting for this view called nominalism. I actually write about this in my technical work. The second thing I would say is scientism, which is a theory of knowledge that says either there's a weak or strong version. The weak version says our best knowledge comes from science. The stronger version says only knowledge comes from science. And that is often thought to entail, especially you can imagine with the strong version, if all of our knowledge comes from science, that entails materialism. The only things that exist are things you can study, which is matter, or physical things. And that is often thought to entail atheism. So I think that theory of knowledge, scientism, coupled with a rejection of metaphysical realism, that would be the first, but now the second. And then the third would probably be, I have a tie between, I'll go with this one. Probably nihilism would be the third one. The view that there's no meaning in the world and no objective purpose to it all. Yeah, I think that's, just off the top of my head. And all of that is a product of the dominant way of viewing the world, which is reductionistic, atomistic, materialistic. Sometimes I call it the neo-Humean view in philosophy. You would maybe just call it naturalism or secularism. But that's the dominant view out there. So the replacement view, I would call it the sacramental view of the world. In philosophy, I call it the Platonic, Aristotelian, Christian view of the world. But it's just the biblical view is what I'd want to replace it with. So I said a lot in there, actually, that I'm just flying over. So, okay, how are we doing on time? We got time for one more question. How about that? Who's dying to ask a question? Or comment, and then we can be done. We got two, so let's do two. How about ladies first, and then in the back.
Well, this is a very old question, very human question. It comes from a pastor's wife.
good. I love that. Yeah, I've written about don't be gunslinging apologists. I've seen these. I've been a gunslinger. Gunslingers are those who take arguments for God or whatever, put them in your little Colt 45, and you walk around looking for an atheist. When you find one, bam, 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 unload it, put it back, and walk away. Don't be that, right? I've done that, and that's really bad. Yeah, we got to love that. Treat them with gentleness and respect is what 1 Peter 3 says. I think that's really a good word. Yeah, thank you. Okay, last comment, question.
So I've never met anyone before who self-identifies as a philosopher, so I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, anomaly.
How that happens, like when you get out of college, you help one and one in philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
How does all
Make
that
lots of
work?
money.
Are your kids going to grow up to be philosophers?
Yeah. No. Well, one did graduate in philosophy. So my journey is kind of interesting. I went to Miami University in Ohio, Oxford, and I graduated with an accounting major. And I was a CPA for the first 3 years out of college. Yeah, so I'll give you the story since we're out of time, though. It's kind of fun. Was a CPA, doing really good. But both my wife and I became Christians through Cru in college, and so we had a huge heart for college students because that's when God changed our lives. So we knew that we wanted to do something with students, so we basically left. I left the business world, came on staff with Cru, and then so we were on staff back at Miami University in Wright State, so it's really cool to be close by. And in my evangelism, I always veered toward the intellectuals. I noticed there's just something about me. Always wanted to have a conversation about the gospel in the context of ideas. And that surfaced what I call a beach ball in my life, and that was this new beach ball was this love of learning. Like, what is the truth about this? And how do you defend Jesus and God and stuff? Because we're generalists with Cru, campus ministers are like generalists. They're good at everything and excellent at nothing, right? I had no time to explore this beach ball, so I shoved it down for the first 3 years of my campus ministry life. But it would just, as the metaphor suggests, it just kept coming up, kept coming up. Finally, I let that beach ball sort of hover at the surface of my life, and I tested it. And so I taught an apologetics class to Cru students. Oh, wait, you guys, Randy, where's Randy and Holly? You guys already graduated. This is my other Miami life, sorry. I was pointing to you, but you weren't here. Taught apologetics to Cru students, learned that they had some needs in apologetics, learned some things about me that I have abilities to communicate in these things. So it's kind of fact gathering and things like that. Long story short, but God did two things that third and fourth year at Miami. Number one, I was leading the guys I was discipling through the Gospel of Luke. And in Luke, there's all these sort of benchmarks where the author says something like, and Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem, kind of showing his methodical walk to the cross. One of those was in Luke 13:31 or 32, and it was where Jesus said to the Pharisees about Herod, like, you go tell that fox, I will continue on toward Jerusalem until I reach my end. And one of the students says, I bet you Jesus was really passionate when he said that. And we're like, yeah, he probably was. And it dawned on me, he was passionate in light of his end, his purpose, his telos, which for him was the cross. And at that moment, I was being asked to either go be a campus director, which means generalist for life, or I was exploring that beach ball. And God just sort of began to whisper into my life, you'll be most passionate about the things of God when you understand that unique telos, or purpose that I've created you for. So it's like one track that God laid. The second track that God laid to sort of put me on this journey that ended with what I do now was that summer in Virginia Beach, doing a summer project now with Cru, and teaching apologetics, still exploring the beach ball. But then I was sitting in church, and someone was sharing the testimony, and you guys will appreciate this because it's our generation. I'm old now too. Chariots of Fire, somebody shared the quote from Chariots of Fire where the runner says to his sister, when I run, I experience God's pleasure. Maybe you've heard this quote. And I remember sitting in the church service that day saying, God, what is it that when I do to experience your pleasure? And it was very clear. God said it's sharing the gospel in the context of the life of the mind. And so it was like the second track that God laid to say, you need to go be a niche player in the kingdom of God. And so from there, it was just crazy. Packed up our bags, finished up one more year at Miami, went to Talbot School of Theology and studied under some of the Christian luminaries in philosophy at the time, J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, and others. Loved it, didn't understand any of it. Somehow I got into a PhD program in Purdue, and that's where you get to teach as a grad student. You get to teach undergrads. And that's where I would walk into a class and I would walk out with an extra step and oh, this is where my heart sings. It's in the classroom. And that's where God sort of revealed, that's the thing I made you for. So there's the quick story of how I ended up. Yeah, never would have guessed at 23 as a young CPA that I would have a PhD in philosophy and be teaching philosophy. But I'm so glad, and I just thank God every day for the privilege to teach students and do what I do. So thank you for asking. That's a fun end. So, all right, thank you all. It's great being with you all. Look forward to being here tomorrow. So,